Hello, it's Susie again, and today I'm going to read to you a story by Kate Chopin entitled Regret. And this was written in 1894 and published a year later. And as I've told you before, Chopin was considered one of the early feminist authors of the 20th century. And her themes are often about women and Southern women. In this case, in a woman who lives in Louisiana, which is where Chopin spent much of her adult life. The main character in this story is a woman named Mademoiselle Aurélie, and she is not married, never wanted to be married, and she lives alone on her farm in rural Louisiana. And one day her neighbor comes and asks her if she will take care of her 4 children while she goes to take care of her ill mother. Now, one thing I want you to be aware of before I start reading is that the dialogue has a southern dialect with French mixed in. And this is because in Louisiana, in this area, there were French Creoles and there were Acadians, what we now refer to as Cajuns, who were French Americans or descendants of French Americans who were exiled from Nova Scotia to New Orleans in the late 1700s. So you're going to hear a Southern dialect with a few French words mixed in. And one last thing, when you hear Chopin refer to Negroes, well, this was in the late 1800s, and at that time in Louisiana, people of color were referred to as Negroes. And remember, this was not too long after slavery was abolished. So just to keep you aware. So now let's turn to the story of Mademoiselle Aurélie and her brush with motherhood and why this is entitled Regret. So, Mademoiselle Aurélie possessed a good, strong figure, ruddy cheeks, hair that was changing from brown to gray, and a determined eye. She wore a man's hat about the farm, and an old blue army overcoat when it was cold, and sometimes top boots. Mademoiselle Aurélie had never thought of marrying. She had never been in love, and at the age of 20, she had received a proposal, which she had promptly declined, and at the age of 50, she had not lived yet to regret it. She was quite alone in the world except for her dog Ponto and the Negroes who lived in her cabins and worked her crops, and the fowls, a few cows, a couple of mules, her gun, which she shot chicken hawk with, and her religion. One morning, Mademoiselle Aurélie stood upon her gallery, contemplating with arms akimbo a small band of very small children who, to all intents and purposes, might have fallen from the clouds, so unexpected and bewildering was their coming, and so unwelcome. They were the children of her nearest neighbor, Odile, who was not such a near neighbor after all. The young woman had appeared but 5 minutes before, accompanied by these 4 children. In her arms she carried little Élodie. She dragged Tinôme by an unwilling hand, while Marceline and Marcelette followed with irresolute steps. Her face was red and disfigured from tears and excitement. She had been summoned to a neighboring parish by the dangerous illness of her mother. Her husband was away in Texas. It seemed to her a million miles away, and Valsan was waiting with the mule cart to drive her to the station. "It's no question, Mademoiselle Aurélie. You just gotta keep those young uns for me till I come back. Do say I wouldn't bother you with 'em if it was any other way to do. Make 'em mind you, Mademoiselle Aurélie. Don't spare 'em. Me there, I'm half crazy between the chillun and Léon not home, and maybe not even to find my po' mama alive encore." A harrowing possibility which drove Odile to take a final hasty and convulsive leave of her disconsolate family. She left them crowded into the narrow strip of shade on the porch of the long, low house. The white sunlight was beating in on the white old boards. Some chickens were scratching in the grass at the foot of the steps, and one had boldly mounted and was stepping heavily, solemnly, and aimlessly across the gallery. There was a pleasant odor of pinks in the air, and the sound of Negroes' laughter was coming across the flowering cotton field. Mademoiselle Aurélie stood contemplating the children. She looked with a critical eye upon Marceline, who had been left staggering beneath the weight of the chubby Élodie. She surveyed with the same calculating air Marcelette, mingling her silent tears with the audible grief and rebellion of Tinôme. During those few contemplative moments, she was collecting herself, determining upon a line of action which should be identical with a line of duty. She began feeding them. If Mademoiselle Aurélie's responsibilities might have begun and ended there, they could easily have been dismissed, for her larder was amply provided against an emergency of this nature. But little children are not little pigs. They require and demand attentions which were wholly unexpected by Mademoiselle Aurélie, and which she was ill prepared to give. She was indeed very inapt in her management of Odile's children during the first few days. How could she know that Marcelette always wept when spoken to in a loud and commanding tone of voice? It was a peculiarity of Marcelette's, and she became quite acquainted with Tinôme's passion for flowers only when he had plucked all the choicest gardenias and pinks for the apparent purpose of critically studying their botanical construction. "'Tain't enough to tell him, Mademoiselle Aurélie," Marceline instructed her. "You gotta tie him up in a chair. It's what Mama all time do when he's bad. She'd tie him on the chair." The chair in which Mademoiselle Aurélie tied Tinôme was roomy and comfortable, and he seized the opportunity to take a nap in it. After all, the afternoon was being warm. At night, when she ordered them one and all to bed, as she would have shooed the chickens into the henhouse, they stayed uncomprehending before her. What about the little white nightgowns that had to be taken from the pillow slip in which they were brought over and shaken by some strong hand till they snapped like ox whips? What about the tub of water which had to be brought and set in the middle of the floor, in which the little, tired, dusty, sun-browned feet had everyone to be washed sweet and clean? And it made Marceline and Marcelette laugh merrily, the idea of Mademoiselle Aurélie should for a moment have believed that Tinôme could fall asleep without being told the story of Croque-Mitaine or Loup-Garou, or both, or that Élodie could fall asleep at all without being rocked and sung to. "I tell you, Aunt Ruby," Mademoiselle Aurélie informed her cook in confidence, "me, I'd rather manage a dozen plantation than 4 chillun. It's terrassant. Bonté, don't talk to me about chillun." "'Tain't expected sich as you would know anything about 'em, Mademoiselle Aurélie. I see dat plainly yes'day when I spy dat little child playin' with yo' basket o' keys. You don't know dat makes chillun grow up hard-headed to play with keys. Des like making 'em teeth hard to look in a looking-glass. Them's the things you gotta know in the raising and management o' chillun." Mademoiselle Aurélie certainly did not pretend or aspire to such subtle and far-reaching knowledge on the subject as Aunt Ruby possessed, who had raised 5 and buried 6 in her day. She was glad enough to learn a few little mother tricks to serve the moment's need. Tino's sticky fingers compelled her to unearth white aprons that she had not worn for years, and she had to accustom herself to his moist kisses, the expressions of an affectionate and exuberant nature. She got down her sewing basket, which she seldom used, from the top shelf of the armoire, and placed it within the ready and easy reach which torn slips and buttonless waists demanded. It took her some days to become accustomed to the laughing, the crying, the chattering that echoed through the house and all around it all day long. And it was not the first or the second night that she could sleep comfortably with little Elodie's hot, plump body pressed close against her, and little one's warm breath beating her cheek like the fanning of a bird's wing. But at the end of 2 weeks, Mademoiselle Aurélie had grown quite used to these things, and she no longer complained. But it was also at the end of 2 weeks that Mademoiselle Aurélie, one evening, looking away toward the crib where the cattle were being fed, saw Valsin's blue cart turning the bend of the road. Odile sat back beside the mulatto, upright and alert. As they drew near, the young woman's beaming face indicated that their homecoming was a happy one. But this coming, unannounced and unexpected, threw Mademoiselle Aurélie into a flutter that was almost agitation. The children had to be gathered. Where was Tino? Yonder in the shed, putting an edge on his knife in the grindstone. And Marceline and Marcelette, cutting and fashioning doll rags in the corner of the gallery. As for Elodie, she was safe enough in Mademoiselle Aurélie's arms, and she had screamed with delight at the sight of the familiar blue cart, which was bringing her mother back to her. The excitement was all over, and then they were gone. How still it was when they were gone! Mademoiselle Aurélie stood upon the gallery, looking and listening. She could no longer see the cart. The red sunset and the blue-gray twilight that had together flung a purple mist across the fields and road that hid it from her view. She could no longer hear the wheezing and creaking of its wheels, but she could still faintly hear the shrill, glad voices of the children. She turned into the house. There was much work awaiting her, for the children had left a sad disorder behind them. But she did not at once set about the task of writing it. Mademoiselle Aurélie seated herself beside the table. She gave one slow glance through the room, into which the evening shadows were creeping and deepening around her solitary figure. She let her head fall down upon her bended arm and began to cry. Oh, but she cried, not softly as women often do. She cried like a man, with sobs that seemed to tear her very soul. She did not notice Ponto licking her hand. And that is the end of our story, Regret. So what do you think she regretted? Until the next time, I'm Susie.